12 miles from Versailles, or 14 by the Sceaux road, nearly 8 from Paris, situated upon the bank of the Seine, shaded with woods and flanked by a tiny hamlet, stood the most famous retreat of Louis XV, the château, or palace called Choisy-le-Roi. As Marly, with its rows of cold salons, its stiff corridors and great suites of rooms, was Louis XIV's ideal of a private house, so Choisy, with its tiny apartments, cozy fireplaces, little, circular reception room, and miniature salle à manger, with ample kitchen and magnificent appurtenances on the first floor in the rear, was the present Bourbon's great delight. Here for 10 years, now, ever since the first months of Louise de Mailly's reign, Louis, in increasing fits of ennui or weariness, and, later still, perhaps, during periods of regret, had been accustomed to seek relief from the formality of his existence in parties taking different degrees of freedom, which, more often than not, rose towards their end to a pitch of positive rowdyism. Only a certain set of the court was ever asked here, and nothing, perhaps, could more plainly illustrate the difference in the characters of Louis XV and of his grandfather than the contrast between the list for Marly in the old days and that for Choisy half a century later. The gaiety to be attained by this party of the 7th of December, however, promised to be less notable in several respects than was usually the case. First, the whole thing must take place in the afternoon, since the king was to return to Her Majesty's salon at Versailles in the evening. Secondly, the gentlemen of the company would have been all day in the saddle, and were certain to be weary and inclined to eat, rather than talk. Thirdly, according to general rumors, His Majesty, and, in consequence, the pages of the court, would be occupied in the kitchen till refreshments were served, thus leaving the lesser lights alone to entertain the women for an hour or more. After the repast it would be necessary to depart speedily for Versailles, in order to be in time to make a toilet for the Queen's salon. As a matter of fact, this entire affair had been planned with the greatest care by Louis himself, who, with purpose very different from usual in visiting Choisy today, had taken care to leave no loophole for impropriety, which, in its wholesale form, was the most distasteful thing that Madame de Châteauroux ever had to endure. At 11 o'clock in the morning Mouthier, with his staff and extra train of servants to assist those regularly installed at the chateau, arrived, and entered immediately upon his duties. In a box which he himself had borne all the way from Versailles on his knee, reposed 12 cases of fresh pastry, with elaborate scrollwork patterns upon their sides and covers. One of these, smaller by half than the rest, was a work of art such as only Mouthier could have contrived. These were the foundations for the dish of the day, and the special case was to be filled with a composition of the king's own, for the delectation of the so-called most beautiful, certainly the most far-famed, lady in France. At something after 2 o'clock in the afternoon there arrived at the grand entrance of the chateau a panel coach, the first of a little procession of vehicles, each bearing a costly burden of petticoat beings, in great pelisses and hoods, with muffs for their hands that were very much larger than any 3 of their heads put together, and had as much in them, perhaps. By 2:30 the circular hallway was a fluttering mass of panniers, silks, brocades, and satins, while the adjoining salons echoed to the hum of light conversation and feminine laughter. No dames d'etiquette in this gay company. No sheep of Père Griffith's flock here, and only one among them to whom this was the first of Choisy. The one was Deborah, who, in direct disobedience to Claude's angry commands, after a sharp quarrel with him, had had her own headstrong way and come hither, to see, forsooth, what it would all be like. As yet she had found nothing, certainly, that could drive from her thoughts the unhappy image of her husband, with the lovelight gone out of his eyes, and she was waiting with intense eagerness for the arrival of the hunting party. The rest of the company being in the same state of anticipation, her restlessness called forth only one whisper from Madame de Gontot, to the effect that it was shockingly bad taste to watch openly at the windows for the arrival of His Majesty. The companion lady sniffed slightly, but presently rustled over herself to join the group of dames, who were looking out upon the snowy driveway and the black, bare-branched trees before them. Presently there came from this little company a quick murmur of exclamations, which occasioned an instantaneous general movement towards them. "I hear no horns." "Have they shot nothing today?" cried one who could not see. "My dear, it is not the king. It is a coach. Ah! Mon Dieu! What is it? Who is it? Who is so late? Are not all here? Deborah had watched the arrival of the coach with some indifference. A liveried footman leaped down from behind and opened the door. Thereupon a woman, hooded and cloaked in scarlet velvet, sable-lined, her huge panniers managed with graceful ease, her great fur muff held high in both hands, stepped forth, alone. "It is the Duchesse de Châteauroux," said Deborah, in a curiously quiet voice, her words being utterly unheeded in the babble rising round her. Was this why Claude had angrily forbidden her to come? Was he riding here simply to meet this woman, for whose sake he had been exiled from France? Naturally she, his wife, the American colonial, was not wanted at the meeting. And thus Deborah leaned back against the wall, having suddenly become very white. "Look at the de Mailly," whispered Madame de Gontaut to Victorine de Coigny. "His Majesty's arrival will be different now." "You belie her. Madame de Mailly is not in love with the king," returned the little Mercale, quietly. The Gontaut did not reply. She had no more time to waste upon Deborah, who had ceased to be observed in the general tumult. The chorus of exclamations fell now to a series of whispers, for La Châteauroux was in the house. How to receive her? After so many months of utter disgrace, was she at once, without protest, to step, with all her old, disdainful insolence, into the second seat at Versailles? Certainly it must have been at royal bidding that she came here. The hopeless daring of the otherwise was not conceivable. Nevertheless, this was a shock difficult to recover from. The whispers, which, during the anticipation, had almost ceased, began to run again round the room. "The Duchess is long enough in removing her wraps. She is disconcerted to find herself before the king. Nevertheless, soon or late, she must face us. Ah, if we but dared, all of us, to refuse recognition! It is impossible. Besides, the king would banish the whole court. Here she is." At last, amid a perfect stillness, Marie and de Mailly re-entered the Choisy room which she had seen last 9 months before. Then, her exit had been the signal for the cessation of pleasure. Her rule was unthreatened, absolute. Now, as she came in, silence. She passed slowly across the room, glancing now and then, to the right and left, at the frozen groups of women who, a year ago, would have risked the ruin of their costliest garments for the sake of the first word with her. Yet now, still, silence. The costume of the Duchess was a marvel to see. But her face received most mental comments. It was so thin, the eyes were so large, the cheeks hotly flushed even through the regulation rouge, the patches emphasizing strongly the marble whiteness of the temples and lower part of her face. An ordeal like this, however, might have turned any woman pale. Deborah realized it, as, dully, she watched Claude's cousin. A kind of pity, mingled with anger at the women about her, came over her own unhappiness. These women, what had they to lose by the arrival of Madame? Not a husband's love. Only a possible smile from the master of a miserable, helpless queen. And so they stood here, like statues, torturing a woman, for the pure malice of it. Faugh! These court ways were not Deborah's. A moment more and 2 women, out of the 20, had started suddenly forward to the Châteauroux. The first was Victorine de Coigny, the second was Deborah Travis of Maryland. As she courtesied to the favorite, and felt one of her hands taken into the cold palm of that golden-haired cousin, a sudden fanfaronade of hunting horns and a cutting of hoofs through the crisp snow to the road broke the stillness. The great Duchess drew a long sigh. Her ordeal was over. In 5 minutes a stream of gentlemen was pouring into the room after Louis, their king, who moved straight to the side of his lady, raised her hand to his lips, and then said, in a ringing tone, "We learn of your recovery from illness with the greatest happiness, madam, and it is our pleasure to welcome you again to our court, where we trust that you will tomorrow resume your former duties, as usual." Then His Majesty, dropping the majesty and his voice together, whispered a few words that brought a smile to the curved lips, after which he stepped back to make way for the press of men and women, who were fairly struggling with each other for the opportunity of speaking to their dear Duchess. Louis, on retiring from Madame's side, found himself near Deborah. Her piquant face had always pleased him. He bent over her now with a gallant compliment. The girl, quickening with pleasure, dropped a courtesy, murmuring, a little confusedly, "Your Majes." "Not Majesty, never Majesty here, dear Madam. I am simple Chevalier, to be addressed only by those who love me. Will you now allow me to continue our conversation?" And Louis smiled slyly. "Yes, Chevalier," was the demure response. "For it is the duty, the due." She stopped speaking, suddenly, her eyes fixed on something across the room. Louis, seeing her expression, at once followed the gaze, and himself presently encountered the look of Claude, who, with face set and pale, was staring at them, oblivious of surroundings, time, and place. The king shrugged. "Pest. It is the husband. He is an annoyance, that man. Well, then, I retire, Madame la Comtesse, to prepare refreshments for our company." Smiling at her astonishment, Louis bowed and left her, making his way to the side of Richelieu, who was talking with Penthièvre. "Come, gentlemen, I retire to the kitchen. See that d'Epernon, de Coigny, de Gesvres, and Savre follow us immediately." Thereupon the king, obstructed by nothing more serious than the wistful glances of the women, passed over to a small tapestried door, which led out of the salon and through a long passage into the celebrated apartment where Malthier and her reverend staff awaited him. "Ah, my good Malthier! All is ready? Hein? Excellent! What menu is there besides our famous pâté? My garments, Clement!" While the chef, with many bows, recited with great unction the enormous quantity of dishes which were to be served as light refreshment for the distinguished company, a young valet of the king's household approached with a set of white linen garments which the king, his hunting coat and waistcoat removed, proceeded to don with great satisfaction. The toilet made, and the white cap set over his wig, he turned to the chef. "And now, Malthier, for the great dish. How does it go? What do we need for it?" "Upon this table, Chevalier, are arranged all the ingredients. They are not, however, prepared as yet." Malthier waved his hand over the special table which was covered with a variety of utensils and the materials necessary for the composition of the vol au vent. Louis went over and began examining them with interest. "How long does it take in the cooking, Malthier?" "In half an hour the dish might be completed. Here is the case of pastry which was prepared beforehand." "Yes, certainly. Ah, gentlemen! You are in time." The last words were addressed to the 6 men who now entered the kitchen in a body. They were at once furnished with garments duplicating those of the king, which they proceeded to don with much real or forced merriment. For all the pages, it must be confessed, did not share their sovereign's love for this plebeian art. No one noticed when Richelieu made a deft removal of something unseen from the pocket of his hunting coat to that of his cooking jacket, for Louis was fussing over the chicken, and the others still jested with each other, or looked, with some distaste, over the large room, with its rough stone walls and chilly floor, and at the great, open fireplace, with its iron hooks and bars for kettles, its spits for roasts, and iron pots swinging on chains or placed in the ashes, from which already fragrant steam was rising. About this great place, which resembled a volcanic crater tipped to one side, clustered a group of Malthier's assistants, busied over various dishes under preparation. "Come, my friends, come. To work! We must not keep the ladies too long waiting, and there is also the return to Versailles tonight. I am famished now." Mouthier once again read to us the rules for vol-au-vent. Mouthier took a slight pause for breath and mental concentration, and then, with joyful obedience, commenced, "Your Majesty will find before him, in proper quantities, which I have myself unerringly measured, the cooked chicken, the uncut sweetbreads and mushrooms, truffles whole, selected coxcombs, essence of chicken jellied, wheat flour of the most delicate variety, fresh butter, cream, an onion, a carrot, salt, pepper, mace, ground spice, and a fine lemon. Now in this small kettle the flour and butter must first be warmed together and stirred to a cream, and when it boils we will add 1/2 the salt, pepper, and jelly of chicken, together with a suspicion of carrot and onion, which must boil in a tout ensemble for some moments." "Yes, yes, yes. I will do it at once," cried Louis, seizing the kettle. Mouthier sprang towards him. "Sire, I beg, I plead, one moment. This must not be begun till the sweetbreads are chopping, the mushrooms and truffles cut in cubes, the lemon grated and its juice pressed out." "Certainly. Let us begin. Mouthier, you shall direct us all as we proceed. De Gevres, you shall prepare the sweetbreads. And I, Chevalier, will cut mushrooms, while d'Epernon, who is on tiptoe with enthusiasm, does the truffles," suggested Richelieu, smiling. "Very well, very well. Marshal, you shall slice the carrot. You may imagine that it is an English army. Savre, weep over the onion, ah! That progresses now." While he flung these rapid phrases about him, the king, with a by no means unskillful hand, had thrown the flour and butter into his kettle, and hurried to the fire, while an attendant made ready a bed of red embers in a corner, where the hottest flames might be avoided. Here, over the first part of his preparation, squatted the grandson of the Sun King, spoon in hand, stirring vigorously, puffing with heat, and mightily enjoying himself. No casual observer, looking into the room at this moment, could have distinguished born cook from marquis, scullion from duke, chef from king. M. de Gevres, his delicate brow damp with the sweat of toil, sat gloomily upon a wooden stool, a flat board on his knees, a villainous knife in his hands, hacking vindictively at the helpless sweetbreads. De Coigny, with a light touch, sliced carrots, and carried on a laughing conversation with Emma de Savre, who, with nose tilted in the air, demolished a very large onion with a very bad grace, while d'Epernon, nearby, his usual blasé manner gone, worked laboriously at the truffles, proving so slow at the business that Penthièvre, after watching him for a moment or two, obtained an implement from Mouthier, and went to his assistance. De Richelieu was more exclusive. He, with board, bowl, knife, and 4 dark mushrooms, had crossed the room and seated himself in a distant corner. Who was to note any change in the appearance of 4 of his fungi? Who suspicious enough and discourteous enough to question such a man about the contents of his earthen bowl when the king, after much measuring, stirring, boiling, and adding, finally called in excited tones for the mushrooms, truffles, and coxcombs, announcing to the anxious de Gevres that for 5 minutes still he must work at the sweetbreads? The 3 dukes, each with his tribute, approached the fireplace, where Louis knelt over the savory mixture, which had by now been transferred to a larger kettle. The truffles, d'Epernon, slowly, with care, voila! 'Tis done. Louis stirred vigorously, and d'Epernon, with a sigh of relief, returned to the table, his task completed. The coxcombs, Penthièvre, so? That is well. That goes charmingly. And now, du Plessis, the mushrooms. They are finely cut? I trust so, Chevalier. The king glanced into the dish, but the flames which danced before his eyes made it impossible to notice the slight trembling of Richelieu's hands. Slowly the contents of his bowl streamed into the rich mixture. That is all now. "Your linen will burn," observed Louis, as the Duke remained standing before him. Richelieu started. "Pardon, sire," he said, absently, as he moved off towards the table. "And now the sweetbreads and the chicken," cried His Majesty. "The vol au vent is nearly completed." "When shall we announce refreshment?" asked Mouthier, as he bent over and sniffed his invention. "In 15 minutes. It is really delightful, Mouthier. Duplessis, my coat." As the Duke helped his sovereign again into the green hunting coat, he took occasion to whisper, with well-concealed anxiety, "Will your Majesty grant me a favor for the afternoon?" "What's that?" "Permit me to sit at table at some distance from Madame de Châteauroux." The king shot a swift look into his gentleman's eyes, and it seemed as though he would speak. Richelieu knew from the glance that the fatal list had already been seen, though not executed, by the master of Versailles. "Sit where you choose." "It will be as usual, or de-etiquette," he said, at length, with indifference. And then, when the others came up, after recoating themselves, His Majesty led the way back to the salons. The re-entrance of the royal group apparently made no stir in the drawing-room. No one rose, but a new, more open note crept into the conversation, and there ensued a short, interested silence as the king, speaking on the way to various ladies and gentlemen, made his way slowly to the side of the Châteauroux, seated himself by her, and told her companion, d'Egmont, by a very readable look, to depart, which the Count did. 5 minutes later the repast, which could be called neither dinner nor supper, was announced. In a slow, rustling stream the gaily dressed dames, and the gentlemen in their disordered hunting suits, poured into the delightful little supper-room, with its panels by Watteau and Lancret, its great crystal chandeliers in which candles already burned, and with its 2 long tables covered with flowers, silver, glass, and decanters of glowing wine. Places were chosen indiscriminately, for no order of rank was observed. Madame and the king seated themselves on the left side of the first table. Richelieu was at the far end, with Madame d'Egmont. Deborah and M. de Guillon sat across from the king, not a great distance down from him, and Claude, with a persistent marquise, managed to face his wife. At the other table Madame de Coigny was in an awkward situation, with Henri de Mélinesle upon her right hand, and her husband, the Marshal, on the other side. Messrs. d'Epernon and Penthièvre also, to their disgust, had been obliged to retreat to the second table, but de Gesvres, always lazily fortunate, was at the right hand of Le Châteauroux, as the king sat at her left. His Majesty inaugurated the meal and an arrow with a toast to our dear friend, Marie-Anne de Châteauroux, and her happy recovery from recent illness. Every glass was promptly raised and the toast drunk after a murmur of concurrence. Madame smiled slightly, in her peculiar way. She was wondering with what heart certain gentlemen near her would have drunk could they have foreseen the morrow. Her eyes travelled to Richelieu's place. No doubt he still deemed her ignorant of the Met's treachery. He should discover, later, his mistake. At the conclusion of the toast the room was invaded by 6 footmen, bearing, on silver platters, the first dish of the afternoon, the long-awaited vol au vent. Just inside the door, however, they halted in 2 lines. There followed a pause, an instant of delay, and then Mouthier himself entered from the kitchen, bearing in his hands a round, golden plate, on which, delicately smoking, was the king's pâté. As it was placed before Madame de Châteauroux a murmur of polite interest rose from every side. "This is for me alone?" inquired the Duchess, smiling languorously at her liege. "For you alone. I made it myself, Anne. Like it, then, for my sake." His words were audible to many around them, and from all sides came little murmurs of applause and praise for such devotion. The favorite's heart throbbed. Her misery was at an end. The old days had at last returned. The waiting had not been in vain. As a footman from the right presented one of Malthier's pates to Louis, her grace slid the pastry cover of her own dish off, and, with a spoon of the same metal as her platter, dipped the hot and creamy filling into her plate. It was not such food as, in her debilitated condition, she should have had. This she was well aware of, and determined that no morsel of any of the other complicated entrees served hereafter should pass her lips. This one thing it was her place to eat. As, for the first time, she raised the fork to her lips, she was conscious of the fire of many eyes. It was wonderful, indeed, that the gaze of Louis de Richelieu did not burn her through all the others, so steadily fixed, so dilating with dire prophecy was it. However, it was the big grey glance of Deborah de Mailly that she caught, as the fork was lowered to the plate again. Deborah was watching, with fascinated curiosity, this woman whom she saw for the second time, this woman for whom Claude had been exiled. Madame turned to the king. "It is a marvel, the most truly delicious thing that I have ever tasted," she said. And her remark was not utterly untrue. The dish was good. "Malthier shall have 50 louis from the treasury tomorrow," observed France. "He invented it." "I shall eat nothing else this afternoon," she added. And the king was quite satisfied with his success. She was true to her word, steadfastly refusing to try the numberless dishes that followed the first. Richelieu, talking rapidly and brilliantly with Madame d'Egmont, watched the golden spoon return to the plate again and again, till that which he had helped the king to make was gone, and his die and hers were finally cast, though the cups would remain over them still for a little while. The meal only endured for the space of an hour. Louis had become visibly impatient and restless. His dish once made, served, and praised, he was satisfied with his day, and would have been glad to start at once upon the return to Versailles. Since this could not be, he made the tedium as brief as possible. Certainly the affair was anything but lively. Deborah wondered more and more why Claude had forbidden her coming here. Her first suspicion that it was his plan to meet his cousin had been gradually dispelled. Perceiving the king's intentions, he had had nothing at all to do with her. The matter was puzzling. To be sure, much champagne and vin d'ail were being consumed by everyone. The conversation flowed easily on the edge of questionable topics, and the broadness of her neighbors' compliments annoyed her. But Deborah had seen all this, and more, in many other places. In fact, it was the common tone of court society. The bugaboo of Choisy and its wild carousings was rapidly being driven from her belief. At a little past 5 o'clock the king gave the signal for the breaking up of the party, and, after a few moments of lingering in the halls over wraps and hoods, coaches began to drive away from the royal retreat into the dark direction of Versailles. The first vehicle to depart was that of the Duchesse de Châteauroux, and in it, beside her, sat the king. Louis was very happy. Marie de Mailly was more to him, infinitely more, than either of her sisters had been. Her type of character, her quiet hauteur, her indifference to many things usually prized, the few demands that she made upon him, her long periods of silence, the hours when he knew her to be suffering as much from ennui as he was himself, all of her moods, in fine, were sympathetic to him, and for this he had made her what she was. Both of them were intensely cold-blooded. He knew that he lacked in feeling. He divined her to be like himself. And this fact, which might have repelled many men, pleased him, as he realized that it put him beyond all danger of rivalry, so long as she was sure of an undivided sway over him. It was a curious drive from Choisy to Versailles. They traversed almost the whole distance in silence. The road was dark, save for what faint light the carriage lamps and the postillion's lantern cast ahead, and the horses plunged rapidly over the frozen road, dragging the heavy coach in and out of deep ruts, and over many stones embedded in the snow. Occasionally Louis spoke in a low voice, and Madame made effort to answer him, but the effort was apparent. She felt strongly disinclined towards conversation, though her brain worked feverishly enough. When finally, about 7 o'clock, the town of Versailles was gained, and there were but 10 minutes left of the drive, Louis broached a necessary subject. "Your old apartments are ready for you, and I have also had prepared for you 2 extra rooms in the little interior courts. In the absence of Elise, our good hen will be your companion. Your servants are already installed, and I have commanded Darganson to meet you at the chapel entrance. We shall not arrive publicly." Madame tried to speak, but was obliged to make 2 or 3 efforts before the muscles of her throat responded. "Darganson goes tomorrow," she said, finally, with a dull intonation. "For your sake, yes. He is hard to spare. I was going to make him Minister of Foreign Affairs." Madame saw no necessity for replying to this, but presently she observed, "So Her Majesty is not yet informed of my return?" "She is unaware that her salon tonight is held in your honor. The court also is ignorant of that. I have planned it so that your appearance may be that of a meteor in the heavens, the rising of an unlooked-for star, a new planet. You treat her, your wife, very badly, France. Morty. She is only a machine for prayers. She does not think." Silence fell on this remark, for the coach was rolling up the approach to the palace. Passing the court of ministers, where was the grand entrance, it entered another long, narrow court, a kind of cleft between the main building and the north wing, halting before a little private door leading into the hallway between the vestibule superior and the chapel itself. This door was open, and by the light of the lantern hanging from an iron projection above it might have been seen a man in household livery, watching. As the king alighted from the coach, the servant called softly, "Monsieur." Out of the darkness beyond came a man, who appeared in time to behold La Chateauroux step from the vehicle. "Darganson, conduct Madame to her suite." "Madame, I have the honor," muttered young Marc-Antoine, faintly. With a small, cruel smile, visible in the lantern light, Marie de Mailly extended her hand. Darganson, inwardly quivering, lifted it to his lips. Something more than an hour later Claude and Deborah, in chairs, arrived at the grand entrance of the palace, and went in together. They were a little late for the Queen's salon, which fact was due to Claude's fastidiousness. Both he and his wife had made fresh and elaborate toilets, and, as Deborah was very much more rapid in her operations than her lord, she had had nearly half an hour to wait for him at their apartment. Debbie Travis never was noted for great patience, save in still-room processes, and though she made no comments, when Claude finally signified his readiness to proceed, it was just as well that a lady's panniers took up all the room in one chair, so that custom obliged him to be carried in another. They went up the staircase of the ambassadors together, in perfect, apparent, amicability, ascended the left side of the second flight, stopping to speak to 2 or 3 more belated couples, hurried through the marble room at the top, and so passed into the Queen's antechamber, in which stood half a dozen gentlemen. From the salon beyond came a subdued murmur of conversation, and Deborah, as soon as a servant had taken her cloak, passed into it. Claude, however, was detained by M. de Pontevessel, who seized him by the coat lapel. "My dear Count, what is the world here for? Why is His Majesty in the next room there? Why do we wait? What is the news?" "You speak like a catechism, monsieur. How should I know the news?" "Humph! You are a de Mailly." "Confessed. What does it betoken?" asked Claude, smiling. "These rumors that La Chateauroux is on her way back to Versailles, are they true? Am I my cousin's keeper?" "You were." "But am not." "Then do you know nothing?" persisted the old fellow, disappointedly. "Nothing, monsieur." "Ah, peste! I am still in everyone's boat. I, also, know nothing. What is one to do? Here is Du Plessis. Ask him. Richelieu was just entering from the salon. As the light from the candles in the antechamber fell upon his face, Claude saw the expression, and wondered a little. It was like that of a harassed animal who has been goaded too far. Going up to Demely, he seized him by the arm, and, adroitly avoiding the importunities of the other man, pulled him roughly to one side. Claude, where is the Duchess? She is late. The king is becoming irritated at the delay. The court knows nothing, and waits to learn. There are all sorts of rumors. Have you seen her? Morty! You hurt my arm. What in the world is the matter? How should I have seen her? Do you think here she is? The Duchesse de Châteauroux was at the threshold of the antechamber, stood there, quite still, for a moment, perhaps that those within the room might see her. She was worth looking at, attired as she was in royal purple velvet, her neck and waist girt with diamonds, her cheeks much rouged, but her temples as white as her powdered hair. Her sister, Madame de Flavicourt, a foil in white, followed at train's length. Ah, Claude, observed Marie, and, in a voice hoarser than usual, I have come to life again, you see. She smiled, extending her hand. Claude took it, wondering at its burning heat. There was no opportunity for replying to her, for, the instant that she began to move forward, the few who were in the small room pressed towards her, eager for a first word. You have returned to us forever, croaked Pont de Vessel, as Richelieu slipped quietly away behind him. Yes, yes. I am making my re-entrance before Her Majesty now. Allow me to pass. Those who saw her suddenly gasp thought it, perhaps, excess of emotion. She made her way through the group in a quick, uncertain, almost tottering way. She gained the threshold of the salon, seeing once more, with failing eyes, that room, as she had dreamed of it so many times. All were before her, court, queen, king. Yes. Louis's eyes met hers, and held them for an instant. She must begin the advance now. But this pain, this new, hideous, torturing pain, this burning of her throat, this frightful thirst. She had been uncomfortable for an hour past. This was unendurable. Walking, standing, were impossible. Her clothes pressed her as though they were of iron. The court stood staring at her hesitation. One or two men started forward a little as if to go to her. Suddenly from her lips broke a harsh, guttural cry, followed by a fainter one, "Au secours!" They saw her try one step. Then, as the sweat of agony broke out, cold and dripping, over her whole body, she sank, in a reckless heap, down upon the polished floor.